Weed, glorious weed. Eat it, vape it, rub it, but should we smoke it? Welcome to Your Healthier Choice. I'm Dr. David. Today we're going to be talking all about ways of taking cannabis. Now, as a physician, I am one who advocates that nobody burn anything into their lungs, whether it's cannabis, whether it's tobacco, or whether it's banana leaves. There are ways that we can be using cannabis that does not involve creating potential issues with our lungs. And so that's what we're going to be diving into more today. So remember when our parents used to say, don't smoke pot? Well, maybe they were onto something, but they didn't say don't use it other ways, right? So that's really what we want to be focusing on. Now, as a physician also, and as somebody who advocates for medical choice, ultimately, this is the user's decision as to what they're going to do. And if a person weighs the pros versus cons and they feel that the benefit of smoking it is in their best interest compared to the risk, by all means, I will always support a person's decision. But I also want to realize that there could be some issues there and let people know that there's so many other ways of using the glorious plant and ways of getting medicinal value from it and so much more. So my role also just as an educator here is just to share this information. As you know, that's what we're all about. So now, back in the old days, as a little trick down memory lane here, people would be rolling joints, packing pipes, smoking bongs. Kind of neat that we actually get to talk about that on video night. That was a faux pas years ago. Now, of course, there were healthier ways. At the time, people would talk about using water pipes, which are bongs, where at least the water would serve as a filtration device to a certain extent and also cooling it down to reduce thermal heat. But now we know that there's other ways that we can do it as well. Now, interestingly, and part of this conversation actually dates back for my family, back to my sister, who back in high school, so this would have been about 1988. She'd done a science project where she was going to see what the effects of nicotine and smoke would be on plants. And so she concocted this device that would serve as that she would extract using a needle and a syringe the smoke of a cigarette down into the water, and she would actually then feed these different plants. I think it was tomato plants, where she did half regular water and half not. And she was expecting that those plants would die. Well, it turned out that the actual nicotine-infused water, those plants actually grew better and stronger. And so perhaps it was the nicotine itself that was serving as a stimulant, but there was no actual smoke there. So she ended up winning the state fair, the state science fair, with a project called Unless You're a Plant, Don't Smoke. So just a little aside as that ways we've been thinking about this for a long time. Now, why should we not smoke? Well, first of all, the temperature itself can create damage to the cilia, which are on our lining of our airways, those little hairs that kind of push up particles and things that are down there up so we can swallow it or spit it up if it's a big cold or something like that. But it can actually damage those so that we don't have that clearing mechanism. Also, the temperature can actually cause other types of damage as well. When a person does smoke pot or smoke the flower of cannabis as a whole, there is still other types of toxins and tars that are involved in there. And also, when a person typically smokes a marijuana, they are usually taking much deeper breaths and holding it longer so that the potential exposure to these substances are going to be much greater than even for a person who smokes a cigarette. And certainly people can get like a chronic bronchitis, smokers hack, that type of thing as well. So, if that's the case, how can people still utilize this? How can people inhale it? Because certainly, while we're talking a little bit about how people can otherwise oral ingest it, there is different effects on how a person feels, what the effect is when a person inhales it versus when they take it other ways. So first of all, there is, of course, the mechanism of vaporizing it. Now, they make cartridges similar to how there are nicotine cartridges that like in Juuls and type of such, but there are at the dispensaries, there are vape cartridges. And there's lots of different ways. You'll see cylindrical ones, you'll see square ones, you'll see rectangular ones, all kinds of pods. Some of them screw in, some of them just snap on in, but they all include a battery. Now, these batteries, sometimes they'll have multiple temperatures, so you can adjust the temperature to affect how much is going to come through and therefore how strong or how less the actual hit itself is. And of course, by doing this, then they're breathing in an oil that is then vaporized and therefore not bringing in any of those plant particles, because there are no plant particles except for the active ingredients, the THC, the CBD, the other minor cannabinoids, the terpenes, but the actual plant material, fibrous material itself is not there. Now, in addition to that, there is what's called dry herb vaporizing. In this, a person will take flower, take the buds, grind it up in a way similar to when a person would roll a joint, but then they'll have devices. They'll have like an oven in it, and then there'll be a oven that heats the temperature up to a temperature where all of the active ingredients, the terpenes and the cannabinoids, are released into the air, but it's at a temperature low enough that the plant doesn't burn. So there's different devices. You can find devices as cheap as $50 to $100. They have things like the Volcano, which would be an $800 use. It's typically more of a recreational device, but I do know some patients who have higher tolerances or have better lung capacities that can do that by themselves. But all of this idea is you put in something that is green, and when you're done, it comes out brown, almost like in a broiled kind of way, but it's not ash. You can see that there's no burning. So this is the difference between convection heat versus combustion. Combustion is when something is actually being burned, and obviously, therefore, the lungs are going to be seeing that differently. In addition to that, there are, of course, other ways as well. Some of the companies have a meter dose inhaler. It's like an asthma puffer, and if you attach that to a spacer, like a lot of kids do for an asthma puffer once they leave the nebulizer form, that works really well, and it's a way of controlling it, because when a person goes, even with an asthmatic, if you go straight to your mouth, most of it hits the back of your throat. Then you swallow it down. It doesn't get into your lungs. But when you put it into a chamber and you kind of puff it out here with your mouth on here, then that is a way of letting it's floating around in the space, and then you can breathe it in a more way that it's going to all go down in the lungs. So that is how we do a meter dose inhaler with a spacer. In addition to that, you will hear about dabbing. If you're not familiar with that already, there are different types of concentrates. There are waxes and butters and resins and rosins and sauces. All of these are different, more solid to gooey types of materials that are done in a manner where there's a different type of device. Typically, it goes to a higher temperature. You will see people who even make rigs with like blow torches. That's nothing that I've ever really seen many patients do, but I've seen people do that. But the idea of it is it's a much more concentrated way, and a lot of times people can get a higher dose out of that. Now, that is not for the recently initiated. This is something that people will typically do, but they have like little handheld devices that you can scoop up a little bit. You know, you'll often hear people talk about a grain of rice size as a proper dose, but certainly not something that I would recommend somebody doing unless they have a fairly good amount of experience already, and then they know that they can handle higher doses. Now, let's leave the inhaled way and talk about some other ways. And now we're going to talk about oral. Now, of course, a person can eat cannabis, and there are people who do that, and they do that through juicing. THC only in THCA, which is the form that's found in the flower, only when it's heated does it convert to night delta THC, which has the intoxicating effects. So one way of not having the intoxicating effect from THC is to not heat it up in the first place. And that's where, again, people do juicing and other types of, but when they cook with it, then it brings the temperature up. So that's why when people make brownies or baked goods, etc., some people will do that, make a butter out of the flour, and then they'll remove the plant material, and then the butter is infused and they cook with it. But of course, there are also like some of these concentrates and distillates where people can also use them, and you have to be very careful on how you mix it up. It has to be uniform, and to make sure that you're getting the right size unit. So if a person's making brownies, making sure that they're exactly 1 inch squares, not bigger and smaller, so that the dose is the same. But this is another way. Now, of course, the dispensaries also have pre-made baked goods, lozenges to hold under the tongue, hard candies and suckers, chocolates, etc. And they are all dosed based upon usually 5 to 10 milligrams. In addition, there are tinctures and capsules. Now, with tinctures and capsules, you typically have to be a little cautious and know what you're getting there, because you will see capsules that are 5 milligrams or 10 milligrams or 25, 50 milligrams. And as well as for droppers and the tinctures, we'll see that there are ones that may have 10 milligrams per dropper per ml, one that has 50. So whenever we are talking about doing something by mouth and swallowing it, we always want to think in terms of milligrams. Now, as one of our Patreon offerings, we're going to actually get a much deeper dive in how to do the actual milligram calculations and dosing. But just to know that, like, don't just say, "Hey, I'm going to take a dropper full of this product because I took one of the other one," because that has a really good chance of messing somebody up because it may not be the same strength. Even from like product to product line, you can see that same company may have different strengths. And of course, if somebody's doing like a 1-to-1 tincture, the amount of milligrams of THC would be different than it was a complete, 100% or whatever of only THC, but not including the CBD. Now, tinctures themselves, as well as lozenges, can be put under the tongue. Now, when that's done, those big veins under our tongue, or even you can take it and rub it around our oral cavity and not drink, when the cannabis is absorbed through the oral lining, as opposed to when it's swallowed, it gets into the body faster, more complete, but also there's a big difference. When a person swallows 9-delta THC, it gets converted in the liver in part to something called 11-hydroxy THC, and this is a more intoxicating form than 9-delta THC. This is the reason why, if you ever hear of somebody overdoing it with cannabis, it's always done with an edible that they swallowed. And also, one of the things is when you swallow it, as well as also tinctures, the onset of action is more variable. It could kick in 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes. And the rookie mistake is the person who takes a cookie or a brownie or some other edible, and they eat it, and an hour later, they're like, "Oh, I'm not feeling anything. I'll take another one." And then maybe 5-10 minutes later, the first one kicks in. And then an hour later, when the second one kicks in, that can overdo it. So you have to be really cautious. Anything that a person's doing in a swallowed or tinctured form, take the dose, and that is it, at least for the next several hours before you do something else. Because again, it can become unpleasant for people. If there ever is a time where somebody does overdo it with oral THC, CBD is actually an antidote. I've seen this work firsthand on a patient once who overdid it. And by inhaling it, so some people will even have a CBD vape pen on hand so that they can quickly, if they did take too much. And, I saw somebody who went from literally being in a stuporous, not really able to answer even basic questions like what day of the week it was and where their child was, to a few minutes later being able to answer all of those questions and just looked up. I remember, she said to me, "Hey, David, what are you doing here?" And I'm like, "Well, I've actually been with you for about 45 minutes trying to get you out of this, and now we've started to do so. Take a few extra inhalations of the CBD, and you'll be good to go." And sure enough, that was it. So a nice little tidbit there of knowing great antidote is the CBD for THC. Now, it's interesting because in Florida, when we place the orders, we put separate orders in for oral, for sublingual, and for edibles, which is kind of interesting because I don't know how somebody else would use an edible or a sublingual if it was an oral, and it blows my mind that we have to actually waste our time putting 3 different orders in for it. I guess people can put things wherever they want, but traditionally you would think that an oral product would cover edibles and sublinguals as well. But anyways, that's on us. We just put the orders in that way. It takes us more time, but at least the patient is able to get what they need. Okay, now there's another way that people will do this, which is transdermal, which means through the skin. One of the ways is done through patches. And if they're an extended release patch, similar to a nicotine patch, can be helpful for a kid going to school. And this involves the concept of what's called microdosing, which is where a small amount is used, but much more often. In this case, it's a continual release all day long. Maybe 1 milligram to 2 milligrams every hour. So this is not something that would bring an intoxicating situation in the first place, but for somebody who may have some, anxiety all through the day, maybe if somebody needs it to help with their appetite, especially if it's somebody who, who's going through chemo, there's certainly some benefits that a person, some of the products can be very helpful for attention and focus. So using a patch can be really helpful, and then a kid's not taking it at school because it's being applied beforehand. Now, also there can be like different types of creams and sports gels, and I've certainly seen people apply it to their joints. I know a patient who's my father who has a neuropathy that he had from shingles, and he gets these like electrical strong impulses every now and then in his chest. But he finds that applying this a few times a day significantly reduces the chances of that happening, as well as the severity itself. So good for neuropathies and things like that. Now, on the patches, you have to be careful. Some of them can actually be cut. And some of them cannot because there's like a micro pouch in it that will actually release it, so they're oil. So yes, if one wants to get a smaller dose or maybe do 1.5 doses, pardon me, a patch could be helpful. But yeah, I would definitely check with the dispensary to make sure that it can be cut in the first place. Just have a little sip of water here. Okay. Now, another way that people can take it, it's not too popular, but by suppository, there are dispensaries who have suppositories. Now, this can be very helpful for people who have Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, disease of their colon, because you can apply the cannabinoids right to the site. It also can be a way of somebody taking it if someone can't take it orally or doesn't like the taste of it. I guess it can be done that way. But interestingly, I've had a few patients who have use it intravaginally. I know that sounds a little weird, but again, very helpful for like menstrual cramps, fibroids. I've had people tell me that. In fact, I've even had people tell me that it kind of serves as an aphrodisiac, which is very interesting, even to the point where I once heard a woman say, when I do it that way, I don't feel high, but my uterus feels high, which, again, I would have no idea what that would feel like, but I thought it was kind of an interesting way of describing it, and she obviously thought it was a really good thing as well. So, yeah, so that's pretty much the different ways of doing it. Again, all about educating you to do it. Certainly, many of my patients and many of y'all will continue to smoke it, and of course, if that's what works for you, that's your blessing. But many people aren't aware that there's so many other ways that cannabis can be used besides smoking it. And especially in some of my seniors, right now, our parents who are saying don't smoke pot are kind of a lot of the people who are taking other ways of doing it now. So again, maybe they were just deciding that wasn't the way they wanted to take it. They just didn't know about anything else. So thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already. Please share it with others. Follow us on social media at pagingdrdavid.com. That's paging drdavidmd. So there's no .com in there. Also, our website is drdavidmd.com. And of course, please follow us on our new Patreon page. Information for that is and links are in the description down below. Hope you have a great day, and I look forward to talking to you soon. Bye-bye.